You know too much for your sake, Lord Kuvera, he said, in a simultaneously placating and menacing voice. I'm being polite and inquisitive merely, Kuvera began, but I have heard it was a Naga that had tried a ploy against you. But then the gods were kind and had gifted you another life. Kali shook his head as he began to move towards his office, passing guards who bowed at him, and Kali just nodded in return. You out of all people know I don't believe in the bloody gods. There are no gods or goddesses. There are just men. I know. I understand your religious skepticism. Kali had been tired of all the opposition by the temple priests, who wanted the Manavs, the progenitors, and the firstborn to be at the forefront of the ruling kingdoms. The Tiavan Bialis were the backwards, the less developed in front of them. Now Kali hadn't practiced any sort of measure on the temples, for they were places of worship and one shouldn't touch the gods if one wanted to avoid a violent reaction or revolution. They had reached the office when Kuvera continued, You must not forget that an attack on you means an attack on me. Let me find out why the Naga rebelled. Kali sat on his seat and contemplated. Or you don't think he rebelled? Kuvera came forward, sitting in the opposite armchair. Oh no, you don't think it was Vasuki? After all, do you? Kali had a certain distasteful feeling about how Kuvera was leading up to this, but he couldn't help it and admitted flat out. Coco and Vikoko investigated, and they said the Naga was not from here, at least not a part of any enlisted regiment. Then it just couldn't be Vasuki. Kuvera leaned back with a straight face. I mean, I'm sure he wouldn't risk it all by bringing an outsider to do this work so you won't get suspicions about him. That just sounds very unlike him. Kali clenched his teeth. Where was the fat man going with this? I'm sure it isn't Vasuki. He just likes you a lot. He believed in you the most. I'm sure it was my money too, but it was his persistence. Kali laid his hand in the front and banged it over the table to cut the king of the Yakshs off. After Takshak died, he blamed it on me and said he would take care of it himself and I wouldn't like it the way he would do it. Kuvera lifted his eyebrows innocently. Dear gods, you are being targeted by him after all. I thought he would keep the differences aside and be a good man. I have never told you why I stole the money from him, which he loves so much. Not because I like shiny things, but because I wanted his ego to be brought down. The money made him beg to me, and I liked that. It brought him to the level where snakes are supposed to be. You know, the mongoose wrapped around Kuvera's neck tighter. He had even named it, which Kali failed to contemplate. He didn't care much about Kuvera's mongoose, but it was funny how his animal and Vasuki's reptile had one thing in common. They were both arch enemies in reality and in nature. We don't know yet, Kali said, sighing. These are just assumptions. I know. I hope you do the right thing, Kali. I don't want you to be hurt. You have returned and you are strong, and I want that you get all the riches possible. Kali stamped his feet and went for a pair of dice he had kept in a small wooden box. He began to rub them together as if he was about to throw them, but he didn't. He continued to rub them in order to alleviate the growing sense of unease building inside him. Do you think if it comes to be proven, we should plan something against Vasuki? Slowly, Kuvera brought up the issue after a brief silence that Kali was enjoying. And before Kali could even say no, there was a knock at the door and Coco entered with his thickly covered armor. My lord, we have a street offender, that Lady Mansa, sister of Lord Vasuki, caught, Coco said. Kali and Kuvera shared a brief glance. What were the odds that the person they talked about was mentioned a second later by another person who didn't even know about their conversation? What had he done? Kali asked. Offenders were hundreds in number and they would be brought here to meet a higher order official to decide the fate of the offender. Coco came inside and placed a folded paper. He was promoting seditious comments about the state and had been influencing the public. Casually lifted the paper and unfolding it, Kali asked, were they influenced? I wasn't there, my lord, but to my knowledge, I'm sure they weren't. Kali saw the paper. It was a diagram of his face with abuses written over it. Should I send him for laborious exile or for a 50-day imprisonment, my lord? Kali scratched his head as he burnt the paper in the fire lamp. He looked at Kuvera, who was surprised by his act. Kali was glad there was a flicker of nervousness crossing Kuvera's face. Where is he? Outside, my lord, Coco said. Kali opened the door, with Kuvera and Coco following, and saw Vikoko standing with two Manav guards, holding the offender. He was young, just a boy, perhaps in his 20s. He had a handsome, cherubic face. For someone like him, Kali was surprised that he was promoting propaganda against Kali and his people. It were kinds of people that angered him, who had absolutely no idea how much hard hard work Kali had put in to reach this stage in his life. Kali came forward, watching the boy, who was looking down. He was surely embarrassed, perhaps seeking forgiveness genuinely. But Kali had other plans prodding him. Kali didn't utter a word, and he didn't let the boy say anything as well. He grabbed the javelin that the Rakshas had, plunging it inside the boy's chest. Kali lifted the javelin to accommodate the boy's body weight with ease, as he began to walk with it, leading it away from the corridors until he was out in the sun. With a sharp twist of his wrist, he dug one end of the javelin on the ground while the other one was up high, almost blocking the sun. The body of the boy writhed over the javelin as he got impaled deeper, his flesh slowly sliding down the pole. All the nobles and the women in the fort watched this scene, horrified, whispering to each other. He turned to face Coco, Vikoko and Kuvera, who remained stunned by the act he had just performed. He was surprised himself, but he was glad too. Listen, he calmly said to Coco, call an artist and make a sketch of this and spread it across the entire city. Anyone who goes against the state will face this consequence. I'm tired of this community's irritating wretchedness. Kali yawned, turning to Kuvera. I suppose I should get to bed. Kuvera watched him for a while, incredulously. He coughed gently. Yes, I suppose you should. You must be, tired. Yes. Kali nodded with a smirk. He moved away from Kuvera and the impaled body behind him, which was drawing in a crowd, but his smile didn't wear off. He had begun planning things for all the tribal heads now. He had plans for Vasuki as well, but it would take time, for he knew the visit by Kuvera meant one thing. He couldn't trust anyone anymore from the council. He had to depend on himself and the ones he could trust. In all these musings, a funny thought popped in his head. His restlessness had vanished, and he knew exactly why. Lord Raghav breathed calmly in Kalki's ears. Don't grip the bow with your fingers. Let it rest in your hand. Raghav walked around it, his fair-skinned body, his face with striking eyes, watching Kalki as he made him put his leg at the back and one in the front. Always remember, 45 degrees angled grip with your fingers over the bow. Kalki nodded. He had a bead of sweat trickling down his cheek as he clutched onto the bow, as tight as possible with an arrow strung up, facing the sky. Now, when you strike, Raghav had a tough voice, effortlessly brusque and deep. You push forward your bow arm towards the target. What should I hit? Kalki whispered to himself. Could it be the elk in front of me? He looked at the elk which was grazing over the grass, unaware of the two men who stood behind the bushes. Raghav shook his head. Animals have as much soul as we do. Never forget that. He tilted the bow towards the bark of a tree. Hit here, and if you can, make a twig fall. Kalki nodded, feeling a pang of guilt for wanting to have hit an animal. But the way Raghav explained it to him made Kalki respect him more than he already did. He never believed he would be in this lush scenery, in the midst of the croaking frogs, and the hooting owls, and the bristling vine that made a whistling sound. Everything was so beautiful here, because it was, in the end, his image formed through channeling. He wasn't able to meet Bhargav Ram, but he was able to learn a little bit about channeling and how to interact with his previous avatars. They were reflections through time, residing in our subconscious, so that they could teach us the ways to hone a particular craft in warfare. Kalki left the arrow. It created a slithering sound as it went past in the air, attacking the twig but failing to have an impact. The arrow fell down. Kalki cursed under his breath, stamping his feet. Raghav walked to the arrow and picked it up. Never despair. He walked back to Kalki and handed him the arrow again. For what falls down can always be picked up. Kalki nodded. He took the arrow again, but then his target began to distort. He felt this reality was crumbling around him, and a soft sound began to plague his ears. Man. The sound echoed in the corridors of his conscience, and he was snapped back, his body jerking, and he realized he had returned to the prison. It was dingy, smelling of dead rodents, and had a guttery feel to it, with the walls leaking black water. He was sitting in a position of penance, before he uncurled his legs and moved to the side, from where the voice had originated. It came from his cell inmate, another one in the hole like him. What are you in for? Murder, replied Kalki. You seem like simple folk from a small village, yeah? Kalki nodded. Which one would that be? Yeah, Shambhala. He couldn't see the face of the inmate right now, but he had seen it earlier when they were all locked in cages and put at the trial in the center of the city. They were supposed to be witnesses for no reason, but Kalki knew why. It was to set the fear in the other prisoners that if they revolted, they died. The inmate had no name, and even if he had forgotten about it. He had a grainy beard that covered his face, with a bald head. Even though the characteristics were same, he didn't remind him even a bit of Kripa. While Kripa had a cunning glint running in his eyes, this man was just sad and tired. "Why are you here?" Kalki asked. "Because I'm innocent. Aren't we all?" "Not sure about ya, but I was blamed for the mistakes I didn't commit," the old man sniggered. "Yeah, as well. You are a quiet man. I have become one. There is a special kind of hell for those who remain silent." He laughed, clapping his hands, and Kalki couldn't help but smile. "In the time of the conflict, there is no conflict here. A conflict doesn't need to be always spatial." He paused, his breathing sounding more like wheezing. "Ya have a family out there?" "Yeah, I don't know. Perhaps, yes." Kalki wondered if Arjun and Bala were safe. "Do you know anyone here in the city?" Not know directly, but yes, he knew of Ratri, Lakshmi's aunt. "I have this one little trick. If you want anything out there for someone to know, let me know, alright? I will help ya in that. I often do that for a price, but for ya, I will do it for free." Kalki smiled. "What makes me so special? You seem like a nice boy, aside for the sore eyes ya can say." He laughed. That was when their conversation had to stop, as the tinkling of sandals was heard. The guards moved, who were guarding Kalki's cage, and they opened it. They made sure to tie Kalki to shackles, and he was forced to bend down. It turned out to be none other than Durukti. She stood there, majestic as always. Just like Arjun, she had a way of pursing her mouth or playing with her fingers whenever she was musing. Kalki had seen enough of Durukti to stop looking at her with contempt, but she was a respected woman here, and yet she had a shadow of sadness masking her eyes wherever she went. She wasn't supposed to be hated, but to be pitied. "Have you thought about it?" Every day she would come with the same offer: work with her. And Kalki would shake his head and say, "I would rather die than work with the woman who destroyed my home." It was a legitimate answer to an absurd question. Why would she think that he would work for her? Out of all the reasons, even if he got a chance to be out due to her, he would hate himself. He wanted to get out on his own. "No, thank you." Durukti turned to see the inmate who had his eyes trained next to the railing. Durukti stamped her feet, and the Nagas came in the inmate's cell and pulled him on the other side with their blades against his neck. "Don't hurt him," Kalki exclaimed. "He has already suffered enough." Durukti told her guards to release the inmate. Durukti knelt down, and it was the first time her eyes pleaded to him. "Please, I don't want to beg to you, but if that is what it takes, I'm ready to do it." Her voice had grown so quiet that the Nagas couldn't hear her. "If my brother finds out I hold you here, he will make sure you get executed. I don't want that." Kalki narrowed his eyes. "Why?" She remained impassive for a moment, but shook her head as if trying to banish the thought. "You can be useful to me. And what do I get? Freedom from death. I have already suffered enough because of you." Flashes of Lakshmi's image came in front of him. The very thought of her poked him hard in his chest. He didn't like to think about her, but he couldn't help it. There is no freedom from death, only freedom from life. "I did what I did to save my brother. He means the world to me. You have no idea how much he means to me." She paused, fighting back tears. "I wanted him to be well." Kalki narrowed his eyes. "You gave it to him? The Soma?" "Yes." Her brows arched. "Why? Did it have an adverse effect on him?" "What do you mean?" "That meant no. Soma could be consumed easily by only two people, Dharm and Adharm." Tension filled his muscles. "No, it can't be." Kalki clenched his fist. "Have you given it to anyone else?" Durukti shook her head. "No, please, if you want me to work for you, make sure you don't let anyone else touch that. And also make sure to not give your brother any more, no matter what." Kalki's eyes met Durukti's eyes urgently. Durukti looked at him, and then nodded. "What if his health fails again? You don't realize the effect Soma has on people." "What effect does it have?" "It is said, it'll take men on the brink of madness, for the power is too great for an ordinary individual." "But is Kali an ordinary individual?" If Durukti was an Asura, so was Kali. That would make the prophecies true. Asuras were born to bring chaos in this world. It all fitted perfectly into a clear puzzle. Durukti stood up. "Your words make no sense. My brother is strong-willed. And all these things you hear, they are village talk, nothing else. What I had given him was tested by shamans and not hazardous for anyone. I keep reserves for him, for the future, and nothing can stop him from taking it. So stop being so." And Kalki lifted his chains, his body feeling the effect of it, his muscles stretching more than it should as he looked at the royal princess. You are a fool. You don't see the truth. Science has corrupted your brain. That was it. The fiery blazing in Durukti's eyes signaled that she didn't wish to entertain this conversation any further. Kalki saw her leave the cage and close it behind her. Put him in confinement and don't let him out until he apologizes and wishes to see me in order to work for me. I want him out of here. Kalki knew what the confinement meant, being in a dark room, tied inside a bucket of water with only the head out, until you felt your bones chilling. Kalki knew he wouldn't like any of that at all. What if he doesn't speak, my lady? The hesitant Naga asked. She looked at him briefly once again. The softness in her face was spoiled by her anger. Let him suffer. I don't care. But she did care. There was a slight hint of it on her face before she left for the main doors. At that instant, Kalki rushed to the rails that were joined with his fellow inmate. His voice was desperate. Get a message to the government official, Ratri. The Nagas came forward and grabbed him by his leash and tugged him hard. He fell back. What should I tell her? Begged the inmate. Tell her. He was being pulled outside of the cell now, and he raised his voice as the two Nagas pulled him towards confinement. Tell her to know that perhaps Kali, the commander of Indragad, is the Adharm, and if it is so, that the dark age has begun. Kalki was engulfed in complete darkness after that, with the last remnants of the light and the parting image of the horrified inmate playing in his mind repeatedly. Arjun had never been to Indragad, unlike Kalki who had had his chance of going there. Arjun was never allowed in the first place, but most importantly, he also didn't want to go. He was too lazy to eschew the comforts of his home, although this often contradicted with his inner desire to explore and see the world. While Kalki felt suffocated in Shambhala, it was Arjun who loved it. But that didn't mean he wanted to stay there forever. He intended on seeing other civilizations that lay beyond Kikatpur.